Hi, I'm Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer. With this video, I'd like to try and answer the question, can a seller with a tenant-occupied property list, market, and sell their property in today's pandemic environment? The answer to this question actually requires two different analyses. One is under the governor's emergency orders based on the pandemic, and the other is under straight analysis of Washington landlord-tenant law and the notices required prior to removing a tenant so that the seller can sell the property. Because these issues are very different and the discussion under the governor's emergency orders is going to be short-lived in the big scheme of things, I'm going to cover the question under the landlord-tenant analysis in a separate video that's part of this video release today. So when I'm finished talking about the governor's emergency orders, please stay tuned, because then I'm going to cover the issues related to the amount of notice that a landlord must give a tenant prior to removing that tenant so that landlord can sell the property. The reason we're doing that is because, if you're not already aware, Washington REALTORS has a robust library of videos intended to help educate our members about legal issues and other issues. And so we want to be able to preserve the analysis under the Landlord-Tenant Act while being able to keep a very short shelf life, hopefully, on this video related to the governor's emergency orders. Okay, we've had a moratorium on evictions signed by Governor Inslee since early March, and it was intended to sunset on April 17th. On Thursday, April 16th, Governor Inslee extended and expanded the moratorium on evictions. The moratorium on evictions now runs through at a minimum June 4th, and the moratorium on evictions prohibits a landlord and property manager from delivering any notice of termination associated with a tenant's occupancy of property. Cast that governor's order in light of the question, can a seller with tenant-occupied property list and market the property? The answer to that question is, on its face, yes, seller can do that. And the Landlord-Tenant Act requires a tenant to reasonably cooperate with a landlord's one-day notice to show the property. So based on black and white law, seller, landlord can sell tenant-owned property. In reality, though, I want you to think through how the Landlord-Tenant Act works. It creates this criteria: landlord can give one-day notice and enter the property for the purpose of showing the property. That would be true for inspections, appraisals, photographers, any sale-related activities that the seller would need. Tenant, though, has an opportunity to reasonably object to the landlord's entry to the property. And under normal circumstances, it would be expected that a tenant might object if, for example, their child were sick that day, or they were sick, or something came up and made it unreasonable for the tenant to have the property exposed that day. But the expectation would be that the tenant would cooperate on a go-forward basis so that the property could be sold. And if the tenant failed to cooperate, then the enforcement available to the landlord is that landlord could take action under the Landlord-Tenant Act, and that action could be ultimately to remove the tenant from the property. With the governor's moratorium on evictions, which includes a moratorium on even serving notices of termination of the lease, whether that notice of termination is based on just a natural expiration of the lease date or based on a tenant's failure to comply with the terms of the lease, all notices of termination are now banned under the governor's moratorium on evictions. Because of that, the enforcement mechanism of the Landlord-Tenant Act is effectively eliminated for landlords and property managers. So what does that mean if you're the listing broker and seller tells you they'd like to list their property and the property is tenant occupied? It means that if the seller has, let me back up. If the seller has a tenant who is 100% on board, compliant with the seller's need and request for the tenant to participate in the sale process, great, move forward. If the tenant is hesitant, however, to participate in the process, listing broker, to the extent your seller can wait, it's probably better for your seller to wait to market that property. If the tenant refuses to make the property available for showings or any of the other related activities, then landlord's just going to be frustrated. They're not going to be able to sell their property, or if they get it sold, they're not going to be able to have the necessary inspectors, appraisers, etc. come through the house to facilitate the process. Ultimately, listing brokers, if you have a seller who's desperate to sell, and I know that those sellers are out there, and they have a tenant who's refusing to cooperate, and I know those tenants are out there, I've heard from many of you. If your seller's in that situation, all you can ultimately do is advise that seller to seek legal counsel. Let the seller's lawyer help them figure out what they need to do. There may be other options available to that seller. There may be other things the seller can do. At that point, you're not licensed or insured to advise a seller as to what those other options may be. The best and only advice you can give that seller is to seek legal counsel. Okay, please stay tuned. The next thing we're going to cover is the amount of notice that's required before a seller can even remove a tenant from the property for the purpose of sale. If you have questions on what we've just discussed or on anything else, as always, please send an email to me, and thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member. Stay tuned. I'll be right back with the next part of this answer.